Hello and welcome to Katrina's Creations. Today is day 8 of our yarn advent calendar. And here we go for day 8. Now after I opened this, one of the question that I asked for being entered into the Christmas in July fairies was, what are your favorite brand of crochet hook or knitting needle? And a vast majority of you picked 3. I mean, there was other ones named, but the majority of the ones that I heard were Boye, Clover, and Susan Bates. So I actually kind of fell down a rabbit hole doing a little investigation about the history of those companies. So after I open this and unwrap it, I'm going to be telling you the history of those 3 companies, which is really interesting. So let's see what we got today. Oh, this is pretty. This reminds me of the one I got a while back that was called Elf on a What's, because it's got some of the same green in it. You can see it here. It's got some of the same highlighter green and some of the same reds. Let's see what this one's called. I Want to See My House from Space. Okay. I don't know what that has to do with Christmas. I don't know. Maybe if you're on Santa's sled. I have no idea. So I'm not real sure where the name quite fits in with this, but here is what it looks like. There you go, and you can see it. So that is the yarn for today. So now let's get started with the history of these crochet hooks. Most of this is referring to crochet hooks. However, all 3 of these companies also make knitting needles. Boye sells knitting needles. I have some. I'll be honest, I don't like the knitting needles, but they do have some. Susan Bates has some. They're also ones I don't care for. The crochet hooks are fine, but I do find that the cords that connect the two they have a lot of memory in them. They tend to be a little stiff because they are cheaper. They are cheaper needles, but their hooks are fine. And then Clover also makes the Takumi bamboo knitting needles, which I had an entire interchangeable set, which I passed on to my daughter because I prefer metal needles over the bamboo. So I passed those on to her. So let's get started. I am going to be reading these notes because it's a lot to remember and lots of dates. So we're going to start with Boye, which is B-O-Y-E. It was founded in 1906 in Chicago. In 1909, they moved to their present location in Chicago. In 1917, the first complete set of steel hooks sold for 5 cents each, and they had sizes 1 through 14. Now, if you remember, a while back, I did a review of vintage Lion brand patterns that were knit and crochet. And I had said that the sizes for crochet hooks and the sizes for needles were different from what we use today. They were not at that point standardized by the Yarn Council. So anyway, now today they're standardized. You know, if you have a size H hook, it's going to be the same size no matter what brand you buy. But that wasn't the case back then. So the sizes went by numbers. They had sizes 1 through 14, and they also started producing knitting needles at that time. In 1921, they brought in sewing needles because they started selling sewing notions, which is a funny story because years ago when my grandmother was still living, now she passed away 20 years ago, but I took her shopping and we were pushing her around in a wheelchair, and she wanted to make this pillow out of ribbon. And so she insisted that Sears still sold like sewing things and stuff, which they didn't at that time. But I took her into Sears, and she went up to the lady in the appliance department and said, I wanted to see your notions department. Where's your notions department? And the poor girl looked at me and had no clue what my grandmother was talking about. And I said, she means sewing notions like needles and thread and all that. And she goes, oh ma'am, we haven't sold that in the store for years. I was like, I tried to tell you, point for me. But anyway, yeah, we finally got her fixed up and she was fine. But yeah, anyway, back to the story, just a little aside there. So in 1923, they came up with interchangeable hooks, and the handles were made of celluloid. Now, celluloid was around before plastic was. It also was flammable, and on some occasions, if it got hot, could explode. Just think about that with your knitting. Guess if you knit too fast or crochet too fast, they just might explode. But anyway, no, doubt that happened, but it's just funny to think about. So anyway, they did have interchangeable hooks and handles all the way back. That would be for crochet hooks all the way back in 1923. In 1925, they brought in nickel-plated aluminum hooks and the flats, which is the little point or the little spot midway on the crochet hook that tells you what size it is. On the other side, it usually has the brand, like it'll say Bates or Boye or something like that. Theirs on their flats said made in USA, and then on the other side it had the size hook, and then it said Boye, and then the size hook. So if you have a Boye crochet hook that does not say made in the USA, it predates 1925. So it's fun to look for them at yard sales. Anyway, 1926, they ended up coming up with a double-ended hook, which was only in existence for 5 years. They discontinued it in 1931. So again, it's something to look for. If you find a double hook, I don't know why you would have one, but if you have a double hook, I guess you could have two sizes, maybe one on each end. I really am not sure, but they did not last very long. They also brought in the first 6-inch hook because prior to 1926, your crochet hooks were 9 inches long. Can you imagine how unwieldy that would have been to work with? They were 9 inches. Now standard size is 6-inch. They also brought out the G and the I sized hook. So they were starting to transition to a different sizing at that point. In 1928, they came out with the K sized hook, which was also in the 6-inch. 1930, they had rug punch needles. I actually have a rug punch needle upstairs in the craft cave because in the 1970s that was a big thing, and you had like a frame with burlap on top of it, and the yarn ran through this needle. It looked like an oversized sewing needle with a handle on the end, and you would punch it through the burlap and it made like a pile carpet. So yeah, that was very popular. My mom made one, I made one, and but anyway, that is 1930. 1932, they were importing circular needles and embroidery punch needles. An embroidery punch needle was similar to the rug punch, just smaller and made for embroidery thread. In 1934, they came out with stitch holders, which are the things that look like giant safety pins. That's for knitting, and for point protectors for your knitting needles. 1935, they discontinued the lacquered aluminum hooks. Now the hooks that were lacquered were color-coded a lot of times. They were like dipped in things, and that's kind of what differentiated the size, was the color. They also came up with crochet forks. Now I had to look up and see what in the world is a crochet fork. A crochet fork is what we now call hairpin lace. The loom for hairpin lace. It's like two wire, not poles, but sticks, and then there's a little thingy in between. I've done hairpin lace years ago when I was like in high school, but I haven't done it since. But one of you mentioned in the comments that you were working on something in hairpin lace. So it's not a craft to hear about that much anymore. Let's see, they also had, like I said, their circular needles at that point, and they came out with plastic hooks. In 1939, which was the year my father was born, they had 9-inch red buckwood hooks. So they were actually wood, and I don't know what red, oh, not buckwood, birchwood, can't read my own writing, red birchwood hooks. So that was in 1939, but the hooks at that time still came in 6-inch and 9-inch. In 1942, during World War II, nickel plating was prohibited because they were using it in the war effort. And so the plating that they would put over top of the steel hooks was black. So if you ever run across black crochet hooks, they are more than likely from World War II era, right down in that time period. They remained black for the remainder of World War II. They also had to stop making steel hooks as well at one point during the war. During 1944 and 45, steel and nickel plating they resumed, so they were able to go back into making their crochet hooks. In 1947, they developed DPNs, or for those of us that knit, it's double pointed needles. You use them for making circular things like socks and stuff like that. In 1949 is when they came out with the what we know today, which are the aluminum color-coded hooks. Then they always have the same size, is a certain color, and that was all standardized in 1949. In 1956, they came out with the knit gauge, which would be for measuring your gauge, just like with crochet or knitting, you do check your gauge. In 1957, they came out with carbon rings. Now, carbon rings are little plastic round rings. You use them for sewing curtains. I've used them for making Dorset buttons, but they still are sold today. They also came up with cable needles, which kind of look like a fish hook, and sometimes they're straight with a little hump in the middle, and those are for doing cable stitches with knitting. In 1958, they came out with latch hooks, which are used for latch hook rugs. 1961, they had flexible needles. I think I used to have a pair of these. I had a pair of knitting needles that my former sister-in-law gave me, and they had been her mother's, I think. I'm not sure where she got them from, but they were plastic and they were very, very bendable. I never used them because I didn't find the yarn slid on them very well. But yeah, they had flexible needles in 1961. In 1965, they came up with Needle Master interchangeable needles. So that's when they first had their first interchangeable knitting needles. 1967, the crochet hook and sizes were officially standardized through the Yarn Council. So it's also known as the CYC. I forget what the first C stands for, but the rest is Yarn Council. And that, let's see, 1983, they came up with comfort crochet hooks. I'm not sure what those are. I know what they are with Clover, so I'm not sure if this is like the rubberized end or what, but they were called comfort crochet hooks. That was 1993. So that's as far up as the history that I could find as far as Boye. I don't think, apparently not much has changed since then that I could find. So now we'll move on to the Susan Bates Company. Now the Susan Bates Company is in Chester, Connecticut. It is the oldest crochet hook manufacturer in the US. It's now out of business, from what I understand, as far as local. It's overseas now. But in 1871 is when it was started. And the original owner, well, he went to work for a shop. His name was Carlton Joseph Bates. And in 1861, so 10 years before he founded the company, he was only 14 years old. And he went to work for a job called at Tyler and Post. They would manufacture ivory crochet hooks from the scraps from piano keys. And his job was to stoke the stove and sweep up the floor before the workers got there in the morning. So that was when he was 14 in 1861. In 1871, 10 years later, when he's 24 years old, he buys the company. So yeah, in 1872, he takes over, buys the company, so he was 25 at the time, and he ran the company until 1893, when he became ill and his son Hamilton took over and ran it until 1954. So there have not been too many owners of this particular company. Hamilton's son and he had two sons, Hamilton Jr. and Wells. They ran it until 1976. So at that point, we're up to 3 generations have run this company. Is that 3? Yeah, 3 companies. And when at that point in 1976, the company became part of the Coates and Clark. If you remember Coates and Clark from sewing departments years and years and years ago, they made a lot of the wooden spools for the for your thread, sewing thread and things. Coates is still around, but Coates and Clark at that time in 1976 were still together. In 1986, Coats bought out Clark. So when you buy thread now, it just says Coats on it. So that would have been in 1986. And they moved in 1986. The entire company moved to Greenville, South Carolina. So everybody that was at the Chester, Connecticut location lost their job at that point. Yeah. So anyway, back to the history of this company. Whalebone became scarce. At one point they were making the crochet hooks from the ivory and from whalebone. Whalebone became scarce and it was discontinued in 1905 because of course the whaling ships weren't doing that any longer. So they did not have access to bone in order to make the needles or the hooks and things with it. So at that point they started using the shin bone of a cow to make the crochet hooks with. And let's see, and those were made, this surprised me. The bone hooks that were made from cow's bones were used up until the 1960s. So I myself have never seen a bone crochet hook, but if you have one, they're an antique. So yeah, and then after the late 1960s, they were replaced with plastic. So as for the branding of the Susan Bates Company, in the early 1930s, it was branded as Chester and Barbara Bates. I'm not sure where the Chester came from, if that was based on the location because they were in Chester, Connecticut. Not real sure. In the early 1940s, they changed it to the Zephyr and Barbara Bates. So these are little tips. If you have old hooks and they have some of these insignias on them, it'll help you date them. And then eventually it was changed to the Susan Bates that we know today. In the early 1900s, they also made wooden hooks. By the mid 1930s, they were doing plastic and celluloid. Now the bone was still being made, but they were also using plastic or celluloid. And by the late 1930s, they had changed over to a lot of aluminum. And like I said, the bone ones were made up into the 1960s. So in the 1940s, the company moved to a larger store. Now I've already told you that they eventually in 1986 moved down to South Carolina, but this is prior to this. This is during World War II. Plastic was used for the crochet hooks because the steel and aluminum production, just like we had noticed with the Boye company, all of that was ceased. And the factory itself converted to making fuel sight gauges for airplanes and glider frames. So the entire company itself was basically making stuff for war, for the war effort. In 1944, they patented the inline design for crochet hooks, because some of your crochet hooks are like slightly tilted to the side and some are inline, so the hook lines up with the flat portion. So they patented the inline design. They also patented a thing which we don't use anymore. It was meant to hold the thread rather than having to wrap it around your finger, I guess. It was called a clips-on thread clip. It hooked onto the top of the crochet hook and the yarn came in through that and then threaded down, so you weren't like tensioning and crocheting that way, I guess. I'm not real sure. I've never seen one. In 1960, they color-coded their hooks. And in 1970, that is when they started taking on the Susan Bates brand name. They also moved to a larger building, still within Chester, Connecticut at that point. And at that portion of between the 1960s and 1970s, they were producing 100,000 hooks and needles a day. They were the largest company for production of crochet hooks at that time. So they were also the oldest and they were also the largest producing. Today, Coats and Clark is threads, or just coats at this point. They're also associated, I thought some of this was interesting. They have also, these companies kind of kept merging. So the Bates company got bought by Coats and Clark, that then became just Coats, that is now part of Red Heart Yarn. It's part, there's Susan Bates. I mean, these are all like subsidiaries of this big conglomerate. And they're all actually owned under the company of Spinrite, which is in Canada. So yeah, this company's gone through a lot of morphing. They now are manufacturing in China, Malaysia, and India. So they have totally outsourced. I think the Susan Bates is still maybe in Greenville, South Carolina, but a lot of the other things have been outsourced to those other countries. So lastly, we come to Clover. And like I said, Clover makes crochet hooks and knitting needles. It was founded, it's the youngest company. It was founded in 1925 by Toshio Okada, a Japanese man. And at the age of 26, he was studying for college, and he was marking his pages in his study books with clovers. He would sit in the park and read his textbooks and his study books, and he would mark where he was. Instead of a bookmark, he was marking it with clovers. And so when he founded the company, he remembered those days, and that's where the name Clover comes from. So in 1948, it became a brand, and that's when he started naming it Clover. It started out as a wholesale company. Then they became a manufacturer shortly after that. In 1983, Clover USA was established in Los Angeles and given the name Clover Needlecraft. And they started selling the Takumi bamboo needles at that point. And later it grew to the North America company. It grew into the North American company that we know today. The headquarters and main manufacturing plant and distribution center are in Osaka, Japan, and where the company is known as the Needle Store. So I found all of that interesting. I just kept diving down the rabbit hole to check all this stuff out. So I hope you've enjoyed a brief history of these 3 different companies that we all know and love. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everybody.